So let's talk about Apex and email. We're going to talk about email from two different perspectives. One is writing code to receive email and then executing some logic. So think of what we might be doing with a email to case type of situation or email to lead. The other thing would be sending outbound email. So from Apex, we could send email to other folks. Okay? All right, so let's first talk about inbound email. So we can create what's called an email service. And an email service is just that. It is a receiver of email which executes Apex code. There's a number of messages that we will process. It is 1,000 multiplied by the number of licenses that you have. So just doing the math, if you have 100 licenses, then we will process on a daily basis 100,000 emails via email services. So let's walk you through the way that you would generate an email service. Well, first of all, you would create the code. You're then going to create the email service. You're going to configure it. You're going to generate a target email address that you would be sending to, and then you would test it out, okay? When we're defining the code, the key thing here is to implement an interface. First of all, this is another example of a use case for a global class, all right? There's an interface called the inbound email handler. And what we're going to do is we're going to implement a method called handle inbound email. And this is the method that the system will call upon receiving the email. Just so you know, in the Force.com IDE, there is when you're creating a class, there's a template and it'll create this signature for you. So it's a little bit of a time saver. The next thing that we're going to do, and I'm going to walk you through creating the new email service through my browser. So to define the email service, we would go out here to develop and then email services. And what we would end up doing is we'd click on new email service. And so here I'm going to call this, San Mateo demo. All right, we would, after we've created, and we'll talk more about the code in a bit, but after we've created the class that's going to run that's going to run when we receive the email, so let me choose that, we would now configure whether or not we want to accept no attachments, all attachments, text attachments, or binary attachments only, okay? These are marked differently when we're working with email. The advanced email security settings, what this does is the advanced email security settings are going to basically use one of three services that check that if we get our email, let's say we get an email from Barack Obama at whitehouse.gov, well, what these do is verify, did the email actually originate from whitehouse.gov, or did it come from evilperson.com or something, okay? There's a second thing that you can do, which is there's the who you want to authorize to send email to this. So you can enter in either a list, a combination of either specific email addresses or domains that you indicate that this email service is authorized to receive email from, okay? There's the convert text attachments to binary attachments. If you're doing something like inserting notes, there's a limitation or a size of 100K versus our binary attachments can be up to 5 megabytes. So if you are receiving large text attachments, you can convert them into binary and then store them that way. There's an active and an inactive. There's also these failure response settings. Here, all of these are the same, but the over the email rate limit action is different. So in the case of, in my example, we had 100 licenses, and so therefore we'd have 100,000 emails. Well, if we have more than 100,000 emails during that 24-hour period, We can choose to bounce it. So in other words, send back a response saying, we can't process it right now. We can discard it, so in other words, just throw it away, or we can re-queue the message, okay? In other words, wait for the next 24-hour period and then attempt to process it at that time. For the rest of these, they have the option of discard or bounce. So here you can go in and whether it's a deactivated email address, we'll talk about that in a second, a deactivated email service, an unauthenticated sender versus an unauthorized sender. There's also some enable error routing, so you can actually send this over to another address and enable that. One thing that I think is a best practice is when you are inside of a sandbox and you're testing this, I recommend that you set these to bounce. And the reason is if you're doing some development, and let's say that you forgot to check the active button on your email service, by default it's set to discard, but you want to be notified, this has been deactivated, and that way it makes debugging a lot easier because you're actually receiving a response. So when you're doing this lab and you're setting up the email service and writing your code, make sure to flip all of those to bounce email so that you'll be notified if any of these conditions are not being met. It's really your decision in terms of what you want to do in production, but here, in my opinion, you might want to lean towards discard, because now if someone's sending you an email message, you're then bouncing it, sending it back to them. Maybe if it's a robot spam type thing, now you're in an email war, something along those lines. So it's your call, but when you're in development and production or in your sandbox, I highly recommend that you set these settings to bounce. It's going to indicate to you problems with what you're doing. All right, so I'm going to click on save at this point. Now the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to need to generate an email address. So you need to generate an address that is the target. Now when you create the email address, here we have a name. We are going to specify that it's active. There's a context user. In other words, who do you want to run this code as? You'll see when we set this up, and by default it uses the email address for the context user. I'm going to click on save here. What it does is the name that you would have entered in there, so San Mateo Demo, defines the left-hand side of the email address. The rest of it, we generate a unique hash. And so you'll notice that it's roughly, these days, it's probably up to more like 30 or 40 characters, pretty long. And then if it's going to be different depending upon whether you're working with a sandbox, you'll notice apex.sandbox.salesforce.com. In production, the sandbox part is dropped. But it generates this unique address for your email service. What I've heard some people doing is setting up their email server with a prettier email address like support@salesforce.com, and then having that automatically forward the emails over to this ugly address. Or if you have a mail to tag, it really doesn't matter, because if the user's clicking on that, it's automatically generating the email address for them. So people have done some other things to make this a more memorable address by forwarding from something else. But at the end of the day, the right-hand side of that email address, you don't control that. Okay, you can't. Unlike Force.com sites, you don't control that portion. Okay, so we'd want to activate this. Let me continue with the slides. So I talked about the advanced email security settings, detecting the authenticity of the email. What is going to happen here within your code, which has the handle inbound email, you're going to receive a inbound email object, which represents the email. So you can access who sent it, who is it sent to, what was the subject, what was the body, and then the list of text attachments, and then the list of binary attachments, right? So you could write your code to do something like, I'm going to iterate over all of the binary attachments. Maybe you're going to create attachment records in Salesforce. Maybe you're going to create something like a case record within your code, for whatever purpose it is that you're achieving here. But basically process that email. Okay? Talked about the failure settings, creating the address, context user, executing your code as that user, and then test it. You can programmatically create an inbound email message to test it out. I talked about the error logs already. There is the email logs, and what this does is, this is found under monitoring. And so this is a log of all of the emails that the email service received. Because there's such a large quantity, what you do is you kick it off where you request the messages from a certain time period. And what it does is it returns for you a zipped up CSV file which contains who sent it, the date and time, and then the subject of the email. It does not capture the body or the attachments of the email. Okay, so it's not a full copy of the emails that we received.